This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened? You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on.
I don't know what's going on. What is going on? We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is not going on? I can't even name anything. Everything is happening.
Yes, well, what we're talking about today is the border and deportation. So Donald Trump has successfully proven that the Biden border crisis was in fact a crisis of choice. He has shut down the southern border. Encounters with illegal migrants are down 94%. In March, we had the smallest number of apprehensions ever on record. Biden could have done this, but he didn't do it. Instead, he let 8 million people, or Trump would say 12 million, 10 million, 20 million, who knows what the number is, a lot of millions of people into this country. And now the Democrats, having allowed these people to come in by choice, are now fighting Trump's efforts to deport the people that they let in illegally into the country. You've got Chris Van Hollen going down to El Salvador to meet with an alleged MS-13 gangbanger. You've got Democrats in Newark storming an immigration facility to try and get people released. Almost all of whom have criminal records. It's insane.
So the thing that forcibly strikes me during almost every one of our podcasts is the same thing, which is there's so many common sense solutions to a lot of the problems that face us. You know, whether it's things where we don't agree with the president, like tariffs, or things where we do agree with the president, like this, immigration. There are things that can be done because in many cases, these are real consensus issues, right? I mean, it's something like 80-20. And, again, people may not like this immigration choice or that immigration choice or this rhetoric or that rhetoric. But if you ask the average American, should it be okay for any guy to just walk up to the border, come in, claim asylum, and be allowed in? They will say, absolutely not. Should that guy be afforded all the rights and privileges of a U.S. citizen having committed this crime of illegal entering the country? Absolutely not. There should be a way to get him and expedite his removal. These are not difficult things to talk about. Most Americans feel the same way. And again, we all reserve a special place in our heart for people who are actually genuinely fleeing human rights violations, who are genuinely fleeing abuse, who are genuinely in fear for their lives. That is a minuscule minority, a vanishingly minuscule minority of these people, most of whom are being brought into the country by traffickers. This is not that hard. And the fact that we have to have this battle royal in our system, in our courts and everywhere else, and have these posers going to prisons in El Salvador to defend gang members who are also wife beaters is insane. It's like a circus. Everything is like a circus instead of a normal adult conversation these days.
Yeah, so I'm doing the numbers from memory, but New York Times poll, something like 86% of Americans said that Trump should deport every illegal migrant who has a criminal record. Something like 64% said everyone who came in the last 4 years under Biden, and something like 55% said everybody who's here illegally should be deported. So you've got a majority who say every illegal migrant should be deported, and a super majority who wants to get rid of the gangbangers and all the rest of it. And it seems like there's an organized effort on the left, supported by Democrats in Congress, to thwart the president from executing the will of the people. And they're going to court and they're demanding due process for these people. And Trump tweeted out a couple of weeks ago, he said, I'm going to read the tweet. He said, or a truth or whatever the heck it is nowadays. How can Biden let millions of criminals into our country totally unchecked and unvetted with no legal authority to do so? Yet I, in order to make up for this assault on our nation, am expected to go through lengthy legal process separating for each and every criminal alien. As usual, two different standards only leading to the complete and total destruction of the USA. Make America great again. And
Yes.
I read that and I tweeted out, Trump is right. It's absurd that Biden is allowed to let millions of people violate our laws and enter the country legally, but Trump has to give each one of them due process before they're expelled. If they can allow millions to come in and then we have to go through every one of them through a process of due process, the left wins. Because what happens is every time they take power, they'll open the borders, let people in, and then we'll get power for 4 years, 8 years, and can't get them out. And over time, they succeed in their effort to have an open borders policy. And people said to me, well, what's the standard? What do we know? What do you mean no due process? And so I thought, maybe we should have a podcast on this and bring on a lawyer who understands this, who gets due process, who doesn't, because I just know in my gut that that's wrong. I don't know the legal answer to it, but Jonathan Turley does. And so I thought we should bring him on and give us the legal answers as to who gets due process, who doesn't. Am I right that we shouldn't have that all these people shouldn't get their day in court, that they should be able to be removed through an expedited procedure? And so we have a great conversation with Jonathan about this.
And look, people will say, oh, conservatives, blah, 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 blah. And the answer is no, a lot of this makes sense. For example, if you're a recidivist, right? If you are an alien who was deported from the United States previously and you came back in, and you guys would
Which
be
a lot of them are.
gobsmacked to understand just how many of these folks who have come in illegally have been deported once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, because once you do it again. And the idea that having already been dealt with in the legal system, you should be afforded endless numbers of do-overs is actually not what our legal system suggests. Just like this guy who was deported to El Salvador. And again, he was deported by error, and I think we have a good and nuanced conversation with Jonathan about that. But the idea that he is somehow the avatar for the Democratic Party, this twice agreed by a judge, member of MS-13, is wrong. I'm sure that there are people who have come to the United States who have a legitimate fear of persecution, but they are in no way any part of any majority that we're talking about. And so the people who they're arguing to protect are people who have taken advantage of our system in ways that are truly dangerous and criminal, and we just need to deal with it.
Well, the biggest lie is that they're defending the rule of law. They're assaulting the rule of law. They violated our laws by refusing to enforce our immigration laws, allowing an open border and allowing millions of people to come in. They brought in people who didn't give a whit about our laws when they were violating them to come in illegally, but suddenly they appeal to our laws to prevent their removal. And they're saying they're doing it in the defense of rule of law. Where was your concern for rule of law when these people were crossing our border by the hundreds of thousands, sometimes in days and weeks, while the Biden administration sat back and allowed it to happen? And really, I have to say, didn't allow it to happen, wanted it to happen, encouraged it to happen, created the conditions for it to happen, because the outcome was what they wanted, was millions of people coming into the country. And now that the president is trying to deport them, you say, well, you're violating the rule of law. You're not, with everybody needs a day in court. I'm sorry. No, everybody does not get a day in court when they violate our laws. And so I think I am of the 86%. I want, and I say this, by the way, Danny, and we have to always repeat this because because it sounds harsh. I am a huge proponent of legal immigration. Right. I want increase the number of people coming here. But you know what the most troubling statistic for me of the last 4 years of the Biden administration was? When Trump left office after the end of his first term, supermajorities of Americans wanted to either maintain legal immigration levels or increase them. And today you have a majority who think we need to decrease legal immigration. It's because you people ran roughshod over the rule of law and opened our borders and allowed an invasion. of this country. And so what do you think people are going to do? You think that people are going to say, let's bring more in? No. So, I'm if you're a supporter of legal immigration, I hope that you're a supporter of expedited deportation.
Yeah, well, good luck with that one. Hey, I want to talk to you about a couple more things, but let's get to that afterwards. Everybody knows our guest. He's been with us a bunch of times, and he is a star of stage and screen as well. Jonathan Turley is the Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law at George Washington University. He's also the director of the Environmental Law Advocacy Center, executive director of the Project for Older Prisoners. Professor Turley has served as counsel in some of the most notable cases, which he actually talks about over the last 2 decades, including the representation of whistleblowers, military personnel, judges, members of Congress. He's testified before Congress more than 100 times, and his latest book is The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage.
Here's our interview. Well, Jonathan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
So we wanted to have you on because there's this dynamic that's happening in Washington in which for the last 4 years, the U.S. government failed to enforce our immigration laws and allowed millions of people into the country without any concern about our laws whatsoever. And now all of a sudden, we're being told that every one of these people is owed due process under law, and they're appealing to the law. They all have to have a hearing before they can be deported. And it seems to me, I'm not a lawyer, so that's why I'm coming to you. That seems to me like that's not correct. So I was wondering if you could give me some legal backup for my gut feeling, which is that no, actually, we can deport people without giving everybody their day in court. Am I wrong or am I right?
No, as usual, Mark, you're right. I've been critical of some moves by the administration, but I'm sympathetic with what they're trying to do. The Biden administration let in an estimated of over 8 million people. And the minute the Trump administration came in, they said, well, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to give individual hearings to everyone, which they know will never happen practically. We just don't have that number of judges. And so the administration is trying to use existing laws to create expanded avenues or new avenues for deportation without those hearings. Because quite frankly, only a small percentage of people here with undocumented status have a viable claim. The vast majority of them claiming asylum are summarily denied once they get into a court, and then they often appeal. So there are different buckets that these people fit into, and some of those do not require these hearings. So it depends on which of those buckets you're in. But the wholesale opposition to the expedited removal of undocumented persons, I think, runs against the last election. It runs against the view of most Americans. But it also runs against logic. I mean, the thing is, the Trump administration does have to find a way of dealing with millions of people. And they can't practically do that by giving every single person a hearing, an appeal, etc. And the fact is, many of these people are caught at the border with paperwork telling them how to game the system, how to immediately find a border agent, immediately claim asylum. And they're often given court hearings that are 5 years in advance. Most of these people have hearings that won't even come up during the Trump administration.
You've referred to this as squatter syndrome, and I think it's a great analogy that these people come in and start living in a property that they don't own, and all of a sudden start asserting rights to the property that they shouldn't or don't have, and then use the legal system to try and prevent the legitimate owners from removing them. Talk to about that a little bit.
Well, the thing that reminded me about this is because all of us have written about the spread of squatters across the country, and most citizens, for good reason, are perplexed how someone can just come into your home with your picture still on the wall and occupy your home. And when you bring in the police officers, they throw their hands up and say, well, they say it's their home. And usually they'll have some rather flimsy document that suggests that it was rented to them. And then the officers say, we can do nothing. So you have to go live somewhere else during a lengthy housing process. And they game that system. They go for appeals with the help of a lot of different groups. And also the reaction is the same in both of those areas. Not only do you have people that are saying, well, occupancy is enough, whether it's a house or a country, we're here, And so we're entitled to the entire legal process. You cannot change that status until we're through it. And then what happens is that they then throw roadblocks, delays to try to extend that out as long as they can. But also the reaction on the government side is the same. This almost passive aggressive response that, well, there's nothing we can do. Sorry about that. We all want strong borders, but due process is everything. And the point here is that saying that due process is everything ignores that cases can be different. And some of these people are not entitled to hearings. But the question is not whether they're going to be summarily removed, but what level of due process is warranted. And Congress has utterly failed here. I mean, these millions of people are making a mockery of the immigration system. I mean, it's laughable that we have an immigration system that is so feeble, so anemic, that it can no longer face the challenge that this country now faces.
So I want to talk to you about the details, the different buckets, who needs a hearing, who doesn't get a hearing. But I actually want to ask you a question, and I want to frame it slightly differently in a way that I think Mark and I tend to think about things very similarly. There was a big argument during the Obama administration in the aftermath of the Iraq War when the Obama administration ended the process of, first of all, rendition, but also of taking terrorists from overseas and putting them, for example, in Guantanamo Bay. And they wanted to bring them to the United States. And then the argument became that these people were entitled to constitutional protections. And the argument that a lot of what I view as normal people made was, no, we're bringing them here to prosecute them. They're not Americans. They're not in this country. They're not entitled. They broke our law. That's why we're prosecuting them. But that's that. And I think for a lot of, again, normal people, that makes sense, right? You bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to America. You don't get to treat him like he was a lawyer in New York. If that's the case, then help me understand why it is that people who violate our law in entering our country are somehow different. Why do they deserve this due process? And are people who are suggesting that the Constitution's argument, which is that anyone in the United States, including illegal aliens, deserve this, are wrong? Help us work this through and sort of why this all applies, which is so confusing to anybody who thinks about this logically.
Well, it's particularly confusing because the assumption is that we can prevent people from entering the country, but the minute they succeed in getting a step across the border, suddenly they go through this legal metamorphosis. And that's part of the problem with our system, is that we need to have more ample ways of dealing with these. Now, the Obama administration started this process that if you were within about 100 miles from the border, you could be summarily deported. But we haven't really addressed that with the millions of other people who are obviously no longer within 100 miles of the border, even though many of them just recently came across that border and have no cognizable claim of asylum. We do have to look at claims like that. But the question is, when can we do that? How fast can we do that? And also whether you can make a claim, even if we send you back across the border, whether you can make a viable claim and keep it within the system. So it is confusing for a great number of people. The argument in these cases is that once they're in this country and they're given a court order, they are here legally in the sense that they're pending a proceeding. And because they're here pending a proceeding, they're entitled with all other persons to the benefits that come with being here. And I think, though, what we're wrestling with here, what Congress has never really done effectively, is to say, let's use some logic here. I mean, our immigration laws, most people don't understand, are far more forgiving and wide open than most of our allies. If you look at things like birthright citizenship that the Trump administration is continually denounced for, our liberal allies in Europe do not recognize birthright citizenship. I mean, we're in a minority of countries that recognize birthright citizenship. Most Americans oppose birthright citizenship. And so across the board in this field, there is this strange just gap between what the public views as the right outcome and also what they view as logical, and then what our legal system carries out or fails to carry out every day.
So, quick follow-up. Help us understand how it is that if you enter the United States in violation of U.S. law, right, without a visa, without a job, without permission, you are presumptively permitted these rights, despite actually being de facto, if not de jure, already a criminal.
Yeah, that is a problem with our immigration laws. Obviously, when someone comes and claims asylum, countries are required to determine if there's a valid basis for that. What's fascinating, by the way, is that asylum hearings are quite short, that these judges are quite familiar with these cases. When they come in, there's really no real evidence. A lot of people are arguing that economic conditions is a legitimate basis for asylum. The Democrats have argued for that, but that is not something that the public has supported, and it's not something really that the law supports. So once they get into court, they're moved along pretty quickly. The problem is that we have a system that was not designed for this massive influx. And so back then, that system could crank out even at a slow pace and stay up relatively well. Now it has just snowballed out of control. It just, for all practical purposes, has stopped. And that's one of the reasons why prior administrations used these new rules to try to create shortcuts. So President Trump's executive order, which was the Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements Order, basically argued for the increased use of expedited removals. And that is actually not a new thing. That comes out of a 1996 law. And prior administration said that anyone who was apprehended within 100 miles of the border that cannot prove that they were legally admitted to the country or have been present for more than 14 days can be immediately removed. So the Trump administration expanded that to say if you've been in the country for 2 years and can't show those things, you can be summarily removed. And also those laws, which if the Trump administration is successful in doing this, those laws can come with a 5-year ban on reentry, but it can also come with a lifetime ban if the individual made false claims to the immigration officials. So that order has significant teeth. That order actually could move a lot of people. Now, even under the past administrations, 44% of removals previously were done under the expedited removal designations. So think of that for a second. When Obama was called the deporter-in-chief, right? It was because of his expedited removals. So our system is so broken that almost 50% of all removals are being done under this expedited removal approach because the rest of them are on this, it's like invading Russia in the winter. I mean, once they get into that system, it takes years and years to take it to conclusion. And if I could add another point here, look at the Garcia case and you can see how the system gets gamed, right? So, Garcia was here illegally.
Tell folks about it from the beginning, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Roberto Garcia is in fact the individual who was deported with a lot of other folks to El Salvador. And he was accused of being an MS-13 member. And that's one of 2 gangs that President Trump has declared terrorist organizations, which can trigger this other law, that he can remove them under that designation. So he gets removed, and it does appear to have been a mistake. Many of us said, look, just bring him back, because I don't think he has a chance in the world of staying here. So bring him back and deport him back to El Salvador. But what happened was, the White House dug in its heels. I still think that was a mistake. They could have gotten around this and avoided a lot of the problems here. You got to pick the hill you're fighting on, and I didn't like this particular hill, particularly because you could just win by bringing them back and deporting them again. But what happened in his case is really an example of how the system can be gamed, right? So he's in Maryland, and they're trying to deport him. Now, keep in mind, he was arrested with MS-13 members. He had tattoos on his fingers that people say represents MS-13. He was wearing garments that are worn by gang members. But also a police source, a confidential source, specifically ID'd him and said that he was about to become a full-time member in MS-13. He'd gone through some type of probationary period. So he goes in front of a judge. He gets due process. He goes in front of a judge. The judge says, you know what? You're removable, right? And he then goes in front of an appellate judge who says, you know what? That judge was right. You're removable. But at this point, his lawyer said that he should be given this administrative hold or this ability of sort of withdrawal from that process. And the reason was that he said he was afraid of a gang in El Salvador that had threatened him and his family. Now, the last stage in this is that after that happened is when Trump declared MS-13 a terrorist organization. Once MS-13 was declared a terrorist organization, people that belong to MS-13 can't use that provision. So the provision that he used is no longer available to him, right? So on top of that, the gang that he cited in El Salvador doesn't exist anymore. The government wiped it out, okay? So if he came back, this would be the shortest of all hearings, right? It would be, first of all, you're not allowed to stay here under the previous order. And second, you're going back to El Salvador because there's not even a good claim there anymore that you shouldn't go, you can't be back there. So, but if you look at what I just described, and that is so convoluted and complex, you get an idea of how the system is gamed, how you can change status, throw in new orders that can be daisy chain, prolonging your time in the United States. And then when you're here long enough, many people then say, well, look, this guy's been here for 20 years. He's been working here for 20 years. He should have a pathway to citizenship.
What's amazing to me is the idea, even before the terrorist designation, that you could make the argument, well, I'm in a gang and there's this other gang that wants to kill me. And so therefore I should be protected and get asylum. It's like the Crips hate the Bloods. The MS-13 has a gang that hates, like every gang has a rival gang. I mean, it's going back to West Side Story. It's like, that's not our problem that you joined a gang and that there's another gang that wants to kill you.
But also, Mark, if you look at what happened, and this is the perfect case for people to see everything is wrong in our system. Because when I found out he had been stopped for human trafficking, I went and watched that video.
I've seen that too, yeah.
I was floored. I mean, first of all, you have this guy who's in the United States illegally, driving someone else's car, packed with people who said they just came from the Texas border, who also have no proof that they're supposed to be in this country. He gives the officer false information that he's driving them to work. It turns out the truck is owned by a suspected human smuggler, a trafficker. And the officer correctly, I don't see how anyone could miss it, says, well, I think this is human smuggling and trafficking, and then lets him go. And it's like one of those movies where you're at the final scene and you turn to your spouse and go, wait, what? How did this turn out with them driving away in the truck filled with people who can't prove that they're citizens of the country?
How did that happen, though?
It shouldn't have happened. He should have held them. But part of the problem here, again, is, I don't know if that's the case here in Tennessee, but in many occasions, you don't have a lot of cooperation with local police and the feds. And also, quite frankly, under the Biden administration, there was not a great interest in moving cases, adding cases back into the system or moving cases along. I mean, what I think that you can conclude, Danielle, and I think this may be the most troubling point here, is that for 4 years, the Biden administration said they couldn't close the southern border, and that was false. And I think the greatest success of the Trump administration thus far, both politically and legally, but also what may be the greatest success in this term, is Trump proved it was a lie. Within a month, he had shut down the southern border using the laws, same laws that Joe Biden had, and cut it down by over 93%. So the point is, what happened in the last 4 years was a choice, right? They could have closed the border, but they didn't. And the question is why?
So one of the arguments you hear with some of these cases is, well, they're not really illegal migrants because Biden gave them humanitarian parole. So and humanitarian parole is something that's supposed to be applied to individuals in individual cases. And he took a provision of the law and applied it to classes of people, right? And so walk us through that. Like, how does that affect the ability to deport people who came illegally, but then were sort of quasi-legalized, or had their status arranged by the Biden administration so that they could stay here and work and sort of wait out their
there's various orders like this, Mark, and including guaranteeing that people could be here for 2 years. And the Trump administration said, you know what, time's up. And when they were brought in, by the way, they were said this status can change. Right? That obviously when you're brought in on something like that, the government says, we're doing this, don't have to do it, and we can stop doing it. So Trump basically said, okay, I'm going to stop doing it, go home. And that's in court now, and there's been judges that have been, saying favorable things for the challenges. I don't think it's a very convincing argument. But the other interesting aspect to all this, and this is where I do have, even though I've been critical of some of the moves of the administration, which I think have been missteps, I do feel sympathy in the sense that no one ever questioned those sweeping designations that brought in millions of people. Nobody ever had a problem with that. But when Trump tries to just reverse those things, he finds himself being hit by national injunctions and sued in dozens and dozens of different court districts.
So I want to talk about two things. One is habeas corpus, and the other is the removals under the Alien Enemies Act. Why don't we start with the Alien Enemies Act? What is your view about the use of this law to deport aliens?
Well, first of all, this is the close cousin of the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, which were used by the Adams administration against its political opponents, including journalists, even a member of Congress. This is the survivor of that. But it has never been struck down, something that the Supreme Court justices have noted recently. It is a sweeping piece of legislation. And it does allow rather unfettered authority for the president under standards that are quite sweeping. Now, part of the issue here is that it was really designed for a war or invasion. And the term invasion is going to now occupy the court in at least 3 different areas. It's been raised, for example, by states to argue that they can unilaterally stop people at the border. That argument is not as prevalent now because the federal government's doing that for them. And many of us questioned whether this could be viewed as an invasion under the Constitution. That was always discussed in a more classic conventional sense of a foreign government, an army invading. The Trump administration has an argument which is not frivolous, which says, well, the meaning of invasion can also apply where a foreign government uses irregular troops, irregular forces, like Venezuela and the TDA gang coming across the border. And they say, look, this gang is really an occupier of land. It runs these areas. It takes over these areas. And the Venezuelan government wanted them to cross the border because they want to undermine our efforts. And so we view this as an invasion. So that's going to end up with a tough interpretive issue for the court. Traditionally, that is not the interpretation the courts have given to the term invasion. This is a novel argument being used with a law that has rarely been used in our history. So the reason I mention that is I've been telling people that they need to tap down the rhetoric a bit, and that includes the president with regard to these judges. I happen to disagree with many of these judges in their injunctions and their rulings against the administration. Some of those rulings have already been reversed. But these are novel questions, and we don't impeach judges because we disagree with them on novel issues. And so you have people like Judge Bosberg, who I criticized from the outset. He was the one that got the Garcia case. And I wrote a column saying, what are you doing? There's no reason why this is in your courtroom. This is a habeas case, and you should not be hearing this matter. And ultimately, the Supreme Court agreed on that. But in the interim, he did issue an order which he says was not followed. I think that we have to trust our legal system and not immediately reach for impeachment and other devices every time we disagree with a judge. So I'm sorry about that long answer, Danielle, but the fact is that I'm not sure how the court will rule on this law. I just think that ultimately the court could find that this is not a real invasion for the purposes of that statute.
Can I just follow up really quickly? What do you think about the argument in this regard? And I agree with you completely. I think it's a much more complex case than advocates on either side want to argue. But what do you think of the argument made by those who look at the letter of the law and suggest you can only use the Alien Enemies Act to remove an individual if you are in a state of war with that country, and we are not in a state of war with those countries? If you want to do so, you have to declare one. What do you think of that argument?
I think that's demanding a bit much of the language. I think that the language clearly indicates a warlike situation, invasion situation. The sweeping language of the law was clearly there to give presidents more leeway at the border. But that does not mean that this would constitute war or an invasion for the purposes of this law. And once again, people need to respect the role of the courts here, because these justices may agree entirely with Trump. I expect that many of them do, about the need to get these people out of the country in an orderly but expedited way. But they also have to worry about displacement. They have to worry about the impact of this interpretation on other issues. For example, you mentioned habeas. Habeas is suspended under very similar circumstances. So if you broadly define the circumstances for this law as being satisfied, to what extent does that then have blowback on the habeas question? That is, does that also mean that these are also grounds for suspending habeas? And that can have an impact on everyone, including citizens.
Well, hasn't the definition of invasion changed since the adoption of the Alien Enemies Act? I mean, back then, most wars were between countries, but 9/11, we were attacked by a non-state terrorist organization, and we spent more than a decade in a war on terror, where we were fighting on the territory of nation states, but not against the nation states, but against the terror networks that were there. And Trump has now declared MS-13 a terror network. So don't sort of the principles, if we were at war with Al-Qaeda, why are we not also equally at war with MS-13?
No, Mark, I think that's exactly right. That's one of the reasons I don't agree with a lot of my friends who say, oh, this is completely meritless. Many of my friends who are saying that happen to be liberal professors who have no problem with interpreting statutes in the Constitution broadly, right? When it came to
Constitution, right?
Right, when it came to
not
Joe
a living
Biden,
Alien Enemies Act.
Right, they were just totally happy with stretching everything to the breaking point, and then suddenly they become these rigid originalists and textualists. And the fact is, this isn't a very good case for that, because originally that was the definition. The question is there any room at the elbows? Do you look at the purpose of the act, or how the problem manifested itself at that time? The purpose of the act is to give the president the ability to protect national security from an invasion of a hostile force. Now, this is not a hostile force in the sense of an organized army, But in many ways, it has proven more damaging than any hostile army could do, right? If the Mexican army came across the border, we would make rather fast work of it, right? I doubt they would get within 10 miles beyond the border. The point that the Trump administration is saying is that countries now use irregular means to achieve the same results. And should these laws be interpreted to like a living document, to use a term from the left? I think that's a really tough question because I am worried about the implications of how this spills over in other areas like habeas. But I am sympathetic to the fact that we've never had this situation where you have this organized introduction of millions of people into the country flooding across the border.
So I said I was going to ask you about habeas. You've raised it a couple of times in the context of the Alien Enemies Act, and I think for a lot of people, the idea, again, just coming back to the original question that I asked you, the idea that illegal aliens who have entered our country with full intention of violating our law somehow are privy to the same rights and privileges that we enjoy as citizens seems a little weird. But you said you're worried about the implications of habeas and that there can be implications for American citizens. Look at the other side. Look at the worrisome side. How would you counsel the Trump administration to walk this fine line where you're not coddling illegal aliens, but at the same time not allowing them to use the habeas protections that they are theoretically afforded under the Constitution, notwithstanding not being here legally, and the worrying part of this, which is actually once you breach that levy, who else can you keep in prison? Japanese, if I recall, somebody did that. Members of the southern states, I recall somebody who did that. So what worries you?
What all worries me, I do nothing but worry these days. But
Same.
I would encourage the president once again to be more discerning about messaging. The public is with the president on immigration, overwhelmingly with the president on immigration. Even a very significant number of Democrats are with the president on immigration. I think going after the great writ, as habeas is called, is going to be unlikely to succeed and will only drain away that support. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas without going to Congress. He was wrong to do so. And he ended up violating the Constitution in a way that I think will always be a lasting mark against his legacy. I just don't see how they can achieve this in Congress. I don't see how Congress would go along with this. But they're already doing things correctly in other areas, and they need to double down on those efforts. They need to try to expand expedited removals. They need to go to Congress, work on improving that system even further. This is a winning issue for the Republicans. Go ask Congress. This should be right up there on their list. If the Democrats want to vote against expedited removals, let them do that. But there is enough here that they can move on it. They also need to really radically increase, as much as they can, the court process, using technology, using video conferencing, using other means that can expedite these cases through. All of that can move them along. Now, does that mean that we can remove 8 million people? No, I've got to be frank. I understand why habeas looks attractive to them. What they would like to do is to say, you know what, you're here illegally, go, and some of you can come back and apply, but we don't have to give you any process at all. I understand why they're doing that, because I think they're looking at these numbers and saying, even if we expand expedited removals, we're not going to get anywhere close to putting a dent in those 8 million people. And by the time this Trump administration's over, you could have another administration that opens up the southern border.
See, that's the problem, is that you get a lawless administration that comes in and ignores our immigration laws and lets millions of people into the country. And then it's impossible for another administration to come in and remove them. And then they come back and open up the borders again and do it all over again. And they win. They're intentionally trying to have an open border. And that just can't be a sustainable situation for our country where
No,
you just
it can. And it gets us back, Mark, to the Squatters Nation column I wrote, that at least with Squatters Nation, the squatters problem, it's not that these big cities actually favor squatters. They just don't want to do anything about it. They don't want to fight with housing advocates. They don't want to bear those costs. When it comes to immigration, you have a very significant number of Democratic politicians that actively want to frustrate any effort to remove undocumented persons. And you're right. We have to either come up with some new avenues or we're not going to make a dent in this. The only promising thing I would say here for Mark, for your point, is that this election did show the Democrats that they don't have the public on this. And even though they have a very enabling media that just pounds on this narrative, it hasn't made a dent in the polls. I mean, the public is not listening to the mainstream media and the narrative. They want something done.
We'll tell that to Chris Van Hollen and the people who stormed the immigration center in Newark. Can I ask you a question that's sort of counter to what of the sentiment that I began this with? So I would argue that the vast majority of people who came here illegally should not be afforded due process. They can be removed, expedited removal. But who should get their day in court? Which classes of illegal migrants or people how do we break it down? Who should get a day in court and who should the president should be able to remove them?
Yeah, the only two grounds that I think are compelling and most people understand is if there is a mistake, obviously. You want to make sure that someone is actually undocumented. There can be people who get lost in the system, but that should be easy to resolve. The second, and this is the tougher one, is under international law, all countries are required to look at asylum cases. But there's room at that elbow as well. You know, the question is, where do they wait while you look at asylum questions? And the problem we're having is this notion of just releasing everyone into the interior of the United States and giving them a court hearing in 5 years. That's a ludicrous system. We have to be able to move these asylum requests faster. The problem is that you may have a small percentage, but still, not an insignificant percentage of people who have legitimate asylum claims. And we have to have a system that can sort of separate the wheat from the chaff very quickly.
You closed out with me, actually, very nicely by simply looking at this and suggesting, look, that we require, this is a huge national challenge and that we require a better system. I and Mark spend a lot of these podcasts, no matter what the topic is, talking about how Congress has given up doing its job. And this is an area where Congress, again, has just given up doing its job. And immigration is crying out for some saner thinking. You raised so many questions. What does it mean? What does invasion mean? How should these laws be interpreted? These laws were given to us by our legislative body. It's their job, but I'm not too sanguine. I think voices like yours are necessary. I just wish there was someone on the Hill listening.
Danielle, what I wish is that Congress could reflect the seriousness of this threat by holding a special session, by showing that we're going to stop normal business and we are going to commit both houses to look at immigration and to move this stuff along. Congress doesn't, obviously, that there's a lot of problems how Congress acts through the legislative appropriation system. It often seems trapped by its own procedures and rules, that it's so calcified that when we have a major crisis, it seems to throw up its hands and say, well, we'll start down that road. Well, that road takes years. We cannot have an anemic legislative branch like that. And I think that's the problem. That, the reason we have so many executive orders and presidents acting unilaterally is because Congress has become this sort of pathetic pedestrian watching crises grow, right? The only time they move quickly is when you ask them to declare a war, right? But they have to have some ability to move quickly in the absence of a declaration of war. You know, yeah, it's true. All politicians have their favorite things and what are so significant, but no one would deny that 8 million people coming into this country is a very serious national security threat.
You'd think.
And I
You
think
would
that,
think, but I think a lot of people do.
yeah,
A lot of Democrats do.
yeah, but I think this is where the public should just watch people line up. Even if you spend a couple of weeks moving this stuff forward and focusing on immigration, let the public see it. Let the public see who is stopping it. And move it in small bits. Don't do one beautiful bill. Move
Yeah.
a series of immigration measures so that people can't say, oh, I voted against expedited removal because it also had a birthright citizenship provision. Go ahead and move them all in small bills and let them line up.
If only.
Comprehensive immigration reform, never again.
All right.
If only. But I mean, this is, with all respect due appropriately to you, this is not freaking rocket science. They should be able to figure this out. And the fact that they haven't is an indictment of our legislative branch.
It is.
And the partisanship. The
Yeah, it
partisanship
is.
taking over our country. If there was a hope that you could get a bipartisan bill to address these issues discreetly without having to bring in DACA and whatever else the heck the Democratic priorities are, then the president would go through the legislative process. It's just there's no chance that the Democrats are going to vote for a tough deportation bill.
No, that's the saddest part of all this is, I'm a Madisonian scholar, so I favor the legislative branch, and I've worked within it. I represented the House of Representatives in the Obamacare case. But I remember when I argued the last judicial impeachment on the Senate floor, and I remember my conversation with Senator Inouye, who came down in the middle of that trial, and we're standing on the Senate floor, and he asked, what does it feel to have a trial with 100 senators as your jury? And I said, what I can't get over is I was a leadership page in Washington. And I used to come to this floor, and all I remember are giants used to live on this floor. People like Moynihan and Javits and others. You came here and you saw giants. And frankly, when I'm arguing this case, I look out and everyone seems really small. And
they've shrunk.
Yeah, and he looked sad and he said, I think of that every time I come on the floor. And what you said, Mark, is very true. There was a time when a coalition would have come together to say, this is insane. Okay, you cannot have a country with open borders. But it seems like that time has passed.
Yes, it has.
That's depressing.
Everything is
That's
depressing.
almost as
these
depressing
days.
as our immigration problems.
Jonathan, thank you as always. Lucid,
you.
clear thinking, great explanations. We love having you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
So this is a question I want to ask you, and actually genuinely. Why do the Democrats support untrammeled, illegal immigration? I understand why the far left supports it, but why does the rest of the Democratic Party support it? I don't get it. I don't understand why they no longer believe in national borders. What do you think?
So I haven't been a Democrat since the 1980s, so it's hard for
Been a
me
while.
to. So my insights into the Democratic Party as a former member of the party are limited. But I think it's a dynamic that happens in politics in all sorts of issues, which is that there is a very, very intense feeling among a certain segment of their base for whom this is like the number one issue, and everyone else gets cowed by it because of the intensity of the feeling, even if it's not a majority opinion of the, let's say, the Democratic electorate or the pop electorate at large. One would think that after having been cowed by their base and losing the election largely over this, think about this. If you're a Democrat, you watch Donald Trump in his first term ride into the White House on the issue of illegal immigration, and the first thing you do as a party when you defeat him is you open our borders and create the worst immigration crisis in American history, and then he comes back and beats you and takes back the White House again. This should be a learning moment. right?
A teachable moment,
for you.
as it were.
A teachable moment, right? That maybe that was not the right position for our party to take. And maybe we should change course and become tough on illegal immigration so that we can be strong on legal immigration. And maybe we should reach across the aisle and work with the president to try and help him deport all these people who came in illegally, and seize on the fact that he has said he wants to expand legal immigration and sort of help him do that and compromise and offer our support. That would be what a normal party does. Learn from your mistakes and try and do something in a bipartisan way to get your credibility back with the American people. Alas, it seems like, I mean, I never thought of Chris Van Hollen as being like a radical leftist.
He's become really crazy and unbelievably anti-Israel as well.
But I just, I've always thought of him as sort of a normal left liberal Democrat, as opposed to being like, the OC Bernie wing of the party. But I guess I'm wrong.
You are.
But, just the idea that you think, and it seems to be a problem that the Democrats are having on a whole host of things right now. They are doubling down on the 20 side of 80-20 issues, on illegal immigration, on, men and women's sports, on, a whole host of different issues that really were harmful to them in the election. And rather than sort of moderating, they seem to be making we're going to stay marching outside AID to defend foreign aid. It's like, this is the path back from the wilderness? I don't get it, but they seem to be very focused on being on the wrong side of 80-20 issues broadly, and this is the biggest one.
Yeah.
Am I wrong? I mean,
no. Listen, I don't get it, and it's funny because I suspect the Democrats don't listen to our friends at the Liberal Patriot anymore, despite the fact that it is run almost entirely by Democrats. But they spend so much of their time talking about what it is the Democratic Party needs to do to get back into competition. I saw great numbers about this when Donald Trump's numbers declined and he went from a net approval to a net disapproval. Chuck Schumer came out and made fun of him for it. Hakeem Jeffries came out and made fun of him for it. And the answer was, the right riposte is, well, you're right. That did happen to Donald Trump. Your numbers are still worse than Donald Trump. Your personal numbers and your party's numbers are still worse than Donald Trump's. And yet, nothing to them seems to sort of wake up this very small d Democratic idea that maybe we ought to listen to the people. I don't get it.
I don't get it either.
Maybe that's what this podcast should be called. I don't get it.
That could be like the weekly supplement. What the hell is going on? And we'll have instead of what the hell extra, we can say, I don't get it.
I don't get it. So I find myself scratching my head all the time. Anyway, folks, if you are too, don't hesitate to let us know what you think. Thanks so much for being with us.
Take care. See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.